Writing in the 12th century, Gerald of Wales describes one of the Welsh weapons used against the English in the invasion of Wales. In the war against the Welsh, one of the English men-at-arms was struck by an arrow shot at him by a Welshman. It went through his thigh high up, where it was protected inside and outside the leg by his iron chausses, which is a mail. And then through the skirt of his leather tunic. Next, it penetrated that part of the saddle which is called the alva, or seat. Finally, it lodged in his horse, driving so deep that it killed the animal. So the arrow went through a leg, 2 layers of chainmail, leather armor, a saddle before killing a horse. Now, in D&D terms, that would, if that's not the sharpshooter feat with a longbow, I don't know what is. This was a new weapon that the English came across that they called the strongbow, and the English were so impressed with it that they adopted it. It became the national sport, and in villages up and down the country, peasants would practice, or freemen, yeomen, would practice with the longbow from a young age, developing the strength in their left arm to use it. And you can it can be told who were longbow users, English longbow users, by the skeletons from the time, because their the bones in their left arm were thicker, indicating a much more developed left arm than the average man. It took years and years of practice to use the longbow, to develop, in D&D terms, the sharpshooter feat. But this was a cultural weapon, a cultural ability of the English and the Welsh. The French king, at the time of the Battle of Agincourt and Crécy, when the longbow was used to such effective use during the 100 Years' War, the French kings instructed their archers, their peasantry, to practice with this weapon. But in England, it was the craze of the day, the sport of the day. It was like football is now, and they just practiced every weekend, all the time, on the village greens against butts. But in France, the sport just didn't catch on, and they didn't develop this skill. This is an example of a cultural weapon or a cultural ability, and today in our 21st century life, we have endless choice, and you can buy practically anything you want anywhere, and in D&D that's reflected. You can choose any skill you want, any ability, anything that exists in the rules, you can combine to create your character. In the real world, things were a lot more limited. In history, things were a lot more limited. Any cultural innovation or tactic would be jealously protected, at least for as long as it possibly could be. And in order to learn these different skills, these different tactics, you'd have to go around and visit these cultures, possibly win the trust of the culture before they would even consider teaching you how to, in feudal Japan, you'd have to become a samurai before you could learn how to use their superior katana. The French knights, the flower of chivalry, I would suggest in D&D terms, they had the great weapon mastery with pikes or lances that they used, and could use it and also they might have the mounted combatant feat, so they could attack with advantage to negate the -5 to get +10 on damage with a charging lance. This skill, their skill in mounted combat, chivalry, as it was known in the time, carried all before it for a while. The Normans mastered the couched lance, and they conquered England, Sicily, Antioch. For about 100 years, they were unmatched on the battlefields. But it was very much a Norman skill, at that time. Before that, it was French, Frankish, maybe, of Charlemagne. But when any weapon becomes dominant, people in other countries develop other skills, other weapons, other techniques to counter that weapon. I suggest it would be interesting if feats and weapons and an extension of weapons in a magical world, spells, were culturally specific and jealously guarded. If you see a fireball cast, you'd know which country the person who is casting that fireball comes from, because only one country has really mastered the fireball. Similarly, I would limit spells to various cultures, weapons to various cultures, feats to various cultures. So in order to learn them, you'd have to travel around these cultures. Obviously, it doesn't give it makes it more difficult for the player, but ultimately I'd suggest it makes it more interesting for the player. It makes for a more real world, and your actual playing experience, if everything's handed to you on the plate easily and you can just choose anything from a smorgasbord of abilities and powers and just come up with the biggest numbers, it's less enjoyable and interesting in the long term than living in a world that more accurately reflects how people are, and you can invest in the world and your part in the world rather than just creating a number exercise. Anyway, this is the way I love to play, and even as a player, I love it when there are limitations limiting the skills, the options you can choose as a player, because it narrows it down and forces you to concentrate more on your character and less on your build. And for me, this makes a richer role-playing experience. My name's Caius. I love role-playing games, and I hope to see you in one in the future.